introduce our speaker, who is Dr. Mackendrick. She combines philosophy with theology, cultural studies, and literary theory to pursue her fascinations with language and all things somatic. She is the author of numerous publications, and that is not an exaggeration. Some of them, just a few of them, are The Matter of Voice, Divine Enticement, Theological Seductions, Fragmentation of Memory, World-Made Skin, and Immemorial Silence. She earned her PhD in philosophy from the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and she's currently at Lemoyne College in upstate New York, where I heard it has already snowed once.
Only once.
So they've already tied our usual average. So they're probably going to beat us this year. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Mackendrick.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd really like to thank the International Studies folks for this invitation. I'm pretty excited about getting to speak about slowness. It actually was fun for me to write this. I often say that. This time it's true. And I think that this theme of slow work is really wonderful and timely, precisely because there never seems to be enough time for it. What I'd like to discuss tonight is the question of slow, hospitable listening, which philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy calls the first hospitality. The ideas that I'll develop come especially out of a discussion that happened just about a year ago when I was visiting to talk about voice in a session of a graduate philosophy seminar on the body. This seminar took place on the evening of November 9th, a Wednesday, the day after the presidential election. The students were distraught, and many of them were uncertain about coming to class at all, thinking that perhaps they should go into New York City, about an hour away, to join in protests instead. Ultimately, they all agreed to meet, but we also agreed that it would be valuable to set aside the first part of the seminar to decompress. The most memorable part of that conversation took place between a white woman and a black man. It is not that they disagreed on what would have been ideal. Neither one of them had loved either of the major presidential candidates. But their approaches to that fact and their actions as a result of it had differed. The man said that urgent circumstances may require some compromise to avoid disaster. The woman resisted in the belief that too much compromise stands in the way of progress. You'll be very relieved to know that I don't intend to revisit their argument further, but I do want to describe an especially striking moment in it, a moment that led me to think a little more about different voices, about what it means to listen to them, and about the remarkable difficulties, but also the importance, of listening hospitably. That moment involved a third speaker, another woman in the class, who saw that the first woman in the conversation seemed to be resisting the point that the man was making. The second woman stepped in very politely to offer some examples to highlight and clarify the circumstances that had led the man to his position. The first woman dismissed this somewhat impatiently, and I realized that she was not resisting the point, or rather was not only resisting it. She simply did not have access to it, no matter how clearly or vividly it was put. In some fairly significant way, she could not hear it. I began to wonder about this inability, which all of us share, though seldom quite so obviously, or to quite such an impressive extent. To say why thinking about that incapacity will lead us into listening slowly, I'll need to start with some theoretical background. So I hope this won't be too dense or boring, or both. First, I want to remark upon the ways in which we acquire our voices and our ability to listen together. Then, I want to describe some more intentional use of words and voices in self-formation and transformation by looking at their use in the pedagogy, especially of monasticism, which I know sounds ridiculously narrow, but I think it turns out to have wider implications. In both cases, if we ignore the part of the process that requires slowness, if we speak in haste and listen impatiently, we lose both ear and voice. We lose the ability to listen, and with it, the capacity to speak in our own voices. Let me begin with the acquisition of voice itself. In using the term voice, I want to imply the fusion of sound and meaning, the words used, the forms into which they are put, the timbre and rhythm and pitch at which they emerge. When we first begin speaking, we don't do so, of course, in a wholly new language. That would simply be making noises. Neither do we speak with wholly new voices. We begin to speak by answering to what is spoken, and in our speech, the voices of our first conversation partners resonate. It's not simply that we imitate those around us, though that too is part of the early acquisition of speaking. It's rather that we take on other voices in our own. There are many ways to respond. Each voice, in writing or in speaking, is a responsive synthesis. This taking on or taking up of other voices is a kind of resonance. It amplifies the original voice, but it doesn't just keep it the same. Voices become what they are in a kind of open exchange rather than in a pre-established form. We sound like those who speak around us. We write like those we've read. For those of us who read a great deal, our speech may even begin to sound like what we've been reading. We take on local accents, sometimes even when we are not born to them. In our voices, the intonations of family and friends echo. But this is never one way. We enter actively into speaking so that we don't just receive voice, we also give voice to ourselves. We speak in a community, contributing to making it what it is, even as it also makes us. We can even take on others' phrases, especially in writing, when we quote. Anne Carson, an author of a quite distinctive voice, asks, "What is a quote?" A quote is a cut, a section, a slice of someone else's orange. Part of what you enjoy in a documentary technique is the sense of banditry. To loot someone else's life or sentences and make off with a point of view is exciting and dangerous. Carson's banditry is not plagiarism, it's revoicing, taking up and taking on another voice within my own. She adds, "The passionate moment echoes from soul to soul. Each controls it temporarily, each enjoys it quote by quote." Quotation is contagion, pleasure moving from body to body, soul to soul by voice. And part of the thrill of that contagion, of that banditry, is hearing the words in new voices, even hearing how they might sound in our own, listening to know whether they become us. In the acquisition of voice, listening can be felt as speech. Wayne Kostenbaum writes in The Queen's Throat, in which he considers opera, "The throat, not the ears, receives the diva. The throat, organ from which I, in scare quotes, speak." He adds, "Listening, your heart is in your throat." When we hear voices by listening as deeply and physically as possible, we receive the voice in the throat and we understand another part of the sense it makes. When we quote, we re-embody language. To develop one's own voice, then, is to find resonance among voices, to learn to hear in speaking. The voice that is mine resonates with the voices to which I have listened, the voices from which I have, often without ever realizing it, drawn my own voice. As music theorist Lawrence Kramer writes, each voice is, at the same time, identical and non-identical with, continuous with, and disjunctive from, any and every one of the others, including itself. Between any voice and any other voice, there is a relationship of calling in Heidegger's sense, of calling into presence. Words call for more words, but this does not mean that words call for filling up all the aural space. In fact, when we speak, we are also, or we should also be, preparing for silence. That is, for the space between our sentences that is meant to invite others speaking. This is the space for which we listen and the space in which we listen. Listening, as much as speaking, is bodily. Jean-Louis Chrétien puts the matter poetically. In order to speak, I have to be able to hear myself. But in order to hear myself, someone must already have heard me and spoken to me in a way that forestalls me, that is, comes before me in both spatial and temporal terms. We have been listened to, even before we speak. That is, we speak into a space. We speak to listeners who are able to hear us. They are able to hear us because we have formed our words and shaped our voices in resonance with theirs. We have been listened to before we speak, and we need to listen in turn to go on speaking well. If resonance is not to become either cacophony or echo chamber, there must be a space, a time to speak and a time to hear. To speak with too much haste and too little attentiveness does not leave silence for other voices, but silences those voices instead. Speaking with speed and without attention too easily becomes inhospitable. This suggests that we are neither pure individual agents nor mindless points in that echo chamber. Rather, we are always speaking. We are always speaking among. We should not be always speaking. Our voice is audible and intelligible to others. Our listening, ideally, open and responsive in turn. We respond within a communal space. Our communities are places in which we share words. This is not quite so simple as saying that a given community might speak English or Spanish or Mandarin. What medievalist Louis Mackey says regarding religious communities applies more broadly as well. It is faith, he says, that constitutes the sign as a sign. How do you know that what you see or hear is language, that is meaningful marks or noises? The ambiguity of signs, which makes it possible for faith to regard them as such, also permits their erasure from significance. A sound bears meaning or ceases to mean to and within a community. Words may take on quite different meanings in communities which put their faith in different things. A politician speaking of our values may strike joy in some hearts and horror in others. It matters who is speaking, and one of the ways in which it matters is that it affects our ability to hear and to know when to fall silent and listen. Thus it is that some words and phrases become dog whistles, which can only be heard by those already attuned to their frequency. We might not speak slowly, but listening, because it requires space for the entry of other voices, insinuates slowness into speech. Academically, we have tended to emphasize individuality and agency, often at the expense of listening and interaction. But there are other ways to fail to listen, and in a few minutes I want to speak of those as well. Before I do that, though, let me turn to a more intentional and more intentionally transformational kind of voice acquisition. In the educational practices that are central to monasticism, which is one of the key sites in which African and European formal education first flourished, the self is deliberately formed and transformed by voices and words. Monastic practice centers on the cycle of what's called the daily office, where the psalms are sung communally at set times of every day, and the choice of which psalms is determined by the set time of the year. This practice is regarded not only as informational, but still more as transformational. The Psalms, containing history, prophecy, law, and emotional expression, provide material that's especially well suited to transforming each monk. Not because they give rules, but because they engage the monks in saying, and indeed singing, the words. That singing voice is important. Athanasius, an important figure in early monastic practice, says, "It is fitting for the divine scripture to praise God, not in compressed speech alone, but in the voice that is richly broadened, for thus it will be preserved that men love God with their whole strength and power." Athanasius declares that reason unites the powers of the soul, and reason, he says, does not intend man to be discordant in himself. Thus, beautifully singing praises, he brings rhythm to his soul and leads it, so to speak, from disproportion to proportion. As Athanasius wrote for specifically male monasteries, we might forgive him his pronouns. Later evidence from monastic women, such as Hildegard of Bingen, suggests a similar high regard for setting the psalms to music. Some of you might know that Hildegard of Bingen is actually most famous for her music now. And those are actually settings that she originally wrote for her monastery. Reason is only an abstraction of music. Music is reason embodied. While Athanasius does not remark on it, singing also builds community in very physical ways. Choirs singing together begin necessarily to breathe synchronously, and even their heartbeats may align as a consequence. Of course, not just any old singing will do, content matters. By taking on the words and the rhythms of the ancient hymns, the very person of the monk is reformed. He acquires the accents of devotion. There is more than one key element here. The practice of self-transformation combines repetition and bodily engagement with long, slow elucidation. The over and over of the daily office and the Psalms marks time at rhythmic, repeated intervals. Singing involves the body with the soul. But in between, the monks study and they listen. They read and they hear sermons on texts. The depth of insight and affect gained in study and sermon in between the hours of the daily office means that each repetition is a little bit different, a little more nuanced and more complex. It means that each monk brings something to the conversation, brings himself. The transformative power of monastic practice is not intended to make each monk indistinguishable from the others. So repetition is essential, but it is not sufficient. By returning both to passages and to practices, we gain the associations that come with that learning in community. Ideally, for the monk, we gain a quiet joy and a contemplative focus. As Megan Watkins points out, when she considers the role of affect in modern education, contemporary education, while individuals are innately predisposed to affective response, much of what we respond to and how we respond is a consequence of learning. The repeated experience of similar affects accumulating in a dispositional tendency. As we learn, we are more inclined to learning. I will soon say a bit more about what affect is and how the word is used theoretically. For now, we may understand it as being very close to emotion, but also involving the body and usually being something communal. Watkins' analysis suggests that part of the transformation of self is the alteration even of temperament. Repetition in the service of transformational learning is part of a complicated temporality that also includes dwelling in, stretching out, and deliberate slowness. All of those elements, again, will change the repetition. They will keep it from absolute sameness, and they demand that we bring to repetition a constant thoughtfulness, even as we gain the transformational power and increasing ease. Instead of more depth and richness each time, re-entering and renewing and changing, if we may just go for another production and iteration of the same, a hardening into place of what already was. And I worry that we already tend this way in education. In part, this is a consequence of being rushed. We are all very busy, whether or not we busy ourselves with anything important. In perhaps larger part, that rush is itself entangled with the intensifying emphasis on producing results. Education is measured in exams, and outcomes must be assessed. If this is what matters, why would we take time to dwell and wander and complicate, when we could simply assert, repeat, and memorize, enough to reproduce the relevant phrases? It would be a bit absurd to suggest that we return education to monastic modes, but I do think that considering their temporal structures, where repetition is alternated with slowness, may be provocative for thinking of education that is transformative and not only assessed. Responding to the call of another voice, I've said, requires a temporal space. We are silent and we listen because we do not always know what the other voices will say. And when we respond, ideally, both our accents and our answers have been shaped by what we heard while we were being quiet. Quotation requires us to attend to the echoes of voices, to think about who it was who spoke, to enjoy the subtle differences of the quoted voice from our own, even as we also enjoy the echoes. Self-transformative communal learning means repetition that indulges in the between times of slowness, not only in order to return and repeat, but for the sake of the understanding and the pleasure of hearing. but we speak in fast times, with frequent repetition, rapid replacement of news and knowledge, and an apparent incapacity to dwell and return. So what does this do to our speaking, to our listening, to our ability to remain or to be hospitable? What might we lose when we turn to repetition alone and strip away the slowness? When we turn to the soundbite that remakes the listener and the speaker without attention, except in the moments of its absolute and unthinking absorption. Nancy, with whom I opened, writes of some of the difficulties of listening within philosophy. He says, in all the cases of philosophical and methodical path, the result is presupposed, an already formed reservation and the provision for the journey. Despite the impressive travels philosophers can accomplish, despite the distances they cover, their paths harbor a secret immobility. This immobility stems from their gaze, fixed on the idea of the result, of the fulfillment and the resorption of tension. That is, we in the academy have tended to write and speak as if words could be voiceless, given only to the eyes, maybe to the ears as we must, but given as the quickest route to the intellect, ideally bypassing the throat entirely. I would not deny that this can be a problem, and in fact, it is one that often concerns me. However, the immobility of voice may also occur in another, and I think perhaps even more dangerous fashion, where the result is still fixed, but the aim now is to sustain the tension and excitement perpetually. To attend to that danger, let us finally consider more carefully the role of affect. Affect theorist Anna Gibbs argues that voice, like face, is one of the primary sites of resonance and contagion, as these terms are used by affect theorists. Think again of Anne Carson's words on quotation, "The passionate moment echoes from soul to soul." While these terms stand for complex ideas, we can get a basic understanding of them, I think, fairly quickly. So the everyday sense of affect is emotion. As it's used in theory, the term refers both to the very fundamental bodily element that emerges in our posture, movement, and facial expressions, such as the way we might duck our heads in shame or wrinkle our noses in disgust. And it also refers to the hard-to-define forces that seem to move not just within us when we feel an emotion, but among and across subjects in various spaces, forces that not only underlie, but also provoke further emotion. Sylvan Tompkins, who is widely regarded as the founding father of affect theory, understands affective resonance as a feedback loop among subjects, in which the affects they share become mutually reinforcing. Affect in a group can become contagious. Gibbs describes what she calls the visceral level of affect contagion, the synchrony of facial expressions, vocalizations, postures, and movements with those of another person, which produces a tendency for those involved to converge emotionally. As this suggests, theories as to how affect moves among people can be complex, but most simply, the idea of affect contagion is that members of a group may come to feel and respond in similar ways without regard for the individual dissimilarities that they brought with them. This idea can be traced back at least to David Hume, an 18th century Scottish philosopher, who was interested in the knowledge not just of ideas, but of what he called impressions. Impressions don't represent anything, but like ideas, they can be transmitted among us. Others, he said, enter into the same humor and catch the sentiment by a contagion or natural sympathy. Hume, who was an unusually well-balanced man for a philosopher, believed that the highest contagion was that of cheerfulness, which could catch up even the sullen and remorseful. Just think of how easily we begin to laugh when others are laughing, or how we're moved to sympathy when we see someone in tears. We don't analyze the impression made by the giggling or the weeping person. It simply, directly, and usually very quickly moves us. Contemporary affect theorists sometimes say that affect is the intensity, while the idea or concept is the content. Neither one of these is wholly in any one person's possession. In their introduction to the Affect Theory Reader, Melissa Gregg and Gregory Sykeworth say that affect is found in those intensities that pass body to body, in those resonances that circulate about, between, and sometimes stick to bodies and worlds. So if we look back to my earlier discussion, we might argue that singing psalms in the daily office combines the transformative content of the text with the transformative affect of joyous contemplation, amplified by the resonance and contagion among communal voices, the circulation of sound and sense. One particularly interesting aspect of voice is that it carries both affect and concept. We speak words that denote ideas as well as sounding in our ears and our throats, and the pitch, tempo, and rhythm of our speaking can show and share affect especially well. When I was first writing about voice, one of my chief concerns was to insist upon its physicality, the ways in which the voice in the throat and the ear is not separable from meaning. My concern today is almost the reverse, to ask what happens when a voice comes close to pure resonance, and the strength of affect intensifies so much that it threatens to eclipse conceptual content. In neither case, of course, does one side completely overwhelm the other. It's fairly evident that both concepts and the ways that they are conveyed bring about a sort of emotional response, even if it's only focus and interest, or boredom and disinterest for that matter. Glossing Tompkins, Gibbs explains that affect is part of a larger cognitive system, but a system that doesn't operate in quite the ways in which we usually understand cognition. In practice, she writes, what this implies is that just as cognitions take on an affective coloring, so too does affect call forth certain ideas and attitudes with which it has become associated in the inner world of the individual. In other words, just as a concept or a perception is likely to carry some emotional charge, so too an affect is likely to come bearing ideas and attitudes, though they might be very vaguely conceived. It's not just that the two are usually joined together as intensity and content, but they too call to each other. So the two can't quite come apart, but one can overshadow the other. And again, I'm concerned now with the intensification of affect so that only the meanings that affect itself opens up and carries within it can be heard in the voices. Excuse me. While I would never claim a single causative factor, I do think that a considerable part of the problem of losing content and overwhelming affect comes out of the loss of slowness. Now that we have developed media that can carry voices quickly and almost constantly to so many people, resonance and contagion too can occur more rapidly and can be immensely amplified. And worry about this acceleration is actually not as new as we might suspect. The French sociologist Gabriel Détard, famous for his studies of imitation and workings of power, wrote in 1899 that, as Gibbs explains it, the newspaper, via the power of repetition, rather than by rational argument or even by rhetoric, succeeds in making the reader hallucinate, a word she uses in scare quotes. The hallucination is sort of a mass fixed idea, not so much a sensory appearance or an absent thing. What people keep reading or keep hearing comes to seem true. Ben Anderson notes that as it became increasingly popular, radio was valorized for the immediacy with which it enables certain collective affects, including the warmth of a voice, to be communicated at a distance. And he quotes a national broadcasting company executive who, in 1941, boasted not only of the immediacy with which radio could convey news and the sheer number of people it could reach, but also, and here's the citation or the quotation, the psychological appeal of the living human voice as contrasted with cold type, even when accompanied with a barrage of photographs now so universally employed by the press. Which is sort of amusing if you've ever seen press from 1941. It seems to us to be pretty text heavy. Gibbs updates these considerations to consider television, where, as she notes, voice can be especially important. She writes, arguably, when it comes to television, sound is in some ways more important than image. Even when we can't see the TV, we listen with a kind of selective inattention to its chatter of voices and the canned laughter, film music and program themes that follow us as we move from room to room or hover at the edge of consciousness as we read or talk or do other things in front of the screen. In such a context especially, the emotional tone of a voice will come to the foreground as meaning slides into the background. In particular, Gibbs, who is Australian, considers affect in the performances of Australian nationalist Pauline Hanson, whose voice strikes many as disagreeable. Hanson's speaking, Gibbs writes, often conveys acute distress, as if she were about to burst into tears. And I brought a sample for us.
Scale back. Tell us why.
Look, it's my concern as well, and I have received hundreds and hundreds of emails from Australians all over the country who are supporting my call for this, mainly in the city.
This here is a ban on much immigration, particularly Muslim immigration. Okay, so I think that was enough for you to get a sense of her voice, right? Please don't play us any more of that. I'm among those who find it fairly disagreeable. Some people, Gibbs says, will find this just about unbearable and will stop listening. But for those who are already feeling distressed themselves, there is an almost irresistible sympathetic connection. We most easily hear sentences with which we agree, but we most easily hear voices with which we feel. Gibbs further points out that it is not only the near tears breaking of the voice that may appeal to distressed listeners, but perhaps unexpectedly, inarticulateness itself. At least, she says, insofar as it functions as an immediate manifestation of distress, rather than simply as a sign for it. We might be conceptually impressed by a clear voice that smoothly unfolds sentences and creates lucid connections, but our emotions are easily grabbed by voices that stumble and repeat. And so now I have another sample of an inarticulate set of sentences for you.
You know what irks me? Look, having nuclear, my uncle was a great professor and scientist and engineer, Dr. John Trump at MIT.
Oops, sorry.
Good genes, very good genes, okay? Very smart. The Wharton School of Finance, very good, very smart. You know, if you're a conservative Republican, if I were a liberal, if I ran as a liberal Democrat, they would say I'm one of the smartest people anywhere in the world. It's true. But when you're...
Okay. So, there's that. Which I thought was a nice example of inarticulateness. It wasn't especially hard to track down, but still. Among the modes of distress that make most of us particularly inarticulate is anger. In a fury, we stammer, fall silent, or repeat ourselves a great deal. Tompkins had already noted that among affects, anger is particularly contagious. Right? I'm afraid not everyone agrees with Hume about cheerfulness. When we perceive that a voice is loud, choked, tense, hissed, or choppy, when the sentences that it forms fail to be sentences at all, but instead repeat phrases or slogans, we may again be inclined to turn quickly away. But we might instead be drawn in to our own share of an anger that, being shared, begins to feel right and righteous. And again, such affects carry attitudes and ideas. The affect of furious fed-upness carries with it various modes of hostility and self-righteousness, and faith in it quickly begins to block out and drown out opposing voices. Affect is not contagious only when we already identify with some figure who carries it, or regard that person positively. It can also be, to use Tompkins' somewhat awkward term, redeintegrative, a mouthful, which means that the affect is less organized, less predictable, less stable. It finds a hospitable milieu, he says, in the contemporary cultural modes of distraction, such as television, the freeway, or the mall. Now only imagine the amplification of these distractions in our online world. The sound of the voice is increasingly contracted and increasingly repeated. Small bursts, catchphrases, half sentences, many times. Recent work on internet memes and viral videos, including their use in politics, suggests that shared and forwarded videos transmit affect indirectly, but widely and rapidly across groups. One 2013 study found that anger-inducing videos were especially likely to be forwarded, so long as the anger is directed at an outgroup, a them, against whom an us can be maintained. So if you have a viral video that shows whomever you don't like in a bad light such that you can be even madder at them, that's the kind that's most likely to be forwarded. As Gibbs writes, we might say then that the media act as vectors in affective epidemics, in which something else is also smuggled along, the attitudes and even the specific ideas which tend to accompany affect in any given situation. Perhaps it is even the case that affects act as triggers that activate a kind of seroconversion of ideas already at play in the milieu of the event. Affects of fear, for example, feed xenophobia readily. With each successive medium, the possibility and the speed of repetition seem to increase, and with repetition, the intensity and the binding power of contagion. As anger resonates more and more quickly across bigger and bigger groups, it carries less and less conceptual reflection. There's no time and no silence for anything else to enter and mute the resonant rage. Anger, as Tompkins likewise says of fear, may even foreclose much cognition at all. Part of this foreclosure involves an assumption of knowing already. Nancy said that listening is always to be at the edge of meaning. That is, listening requires permitting a bit of uncertainty and insecurity, a willingness to change one's mind as well as one's mood. When we listen to another person, we listen to the call not only of her words, but also of the world from which those words speak and in which they respond, the world in which they have their sense. We try to hear the sense of her community, of her embodiment, from which her voice might reach us. The only way to do this is to suspend the presumptions that underpin our usual understanding. And mostly, we don't like risks or uncertainties. They can be uncomfortable. It is easier, especially when we have gotten comfortably entrenched in the repetition and sharing of our attitudes, emotions, and concepts, either to dismiss new ideas or to subsume them to the already known. This is especially easy when the conceptual content might challenge the attitudes we bear. Who has time for so much alteration? When affect resonates emptied of most of its possible content beyond its own intensity, it may, Tompkins suggests, attract varying personalities to a similar ideology for different reasons. In the same way, two different persons may fall in love with a third because of separate motives. Affective resonance becomes a powerful force because of its intersubjective tendencies. Affects spread among persons and gain strength when oscillating between those persons. That is, as I've suggested, a sort of emotional volume increases as contagion spreads. It can catch up otherwise quite different people who are borne along by the pleasure, even of rage, containing some particular concept. Like anything powerful, this contagion can be dangerous. Tompkins notes that charismatic tyrants exploit the shared affective states of crowd to manipulate political authority. The modes of distraction that repeat before us easily entice us away from the discipline of attention, of a carefully open listening, of the time that we must take between repetitions in order to think, of the time that we must take between speeches in order to hear. There's no need to bore ourselves by exerting effort to understand something as foreign or new. Instead, as nearly as possible, we can bathe in pure affective resonance, shouting out affirmation in the gaps of inarticulate speech, becoming suspicious of articulateness itself as a mode of elitist detachment, an effort to call our affects a lie. We delight not in quotation but in slogan, called out and repeated as if it were meaningful, strengthened again by pure volume. reaffirming itself, leaving no silent space for question, no slow space for reflection, no alteration in accent when another might answer back. In our echo chambers, there sounds a single loud amplified resonant voice, stripped of any meaning not carried by affect contagion, which thus frees it from the need for analysis. When words are repeated quickly as slogans and sound bites, and when discourse becomes too inarticulate to hold up under the strain of concepts, this repetition without slowness, rapidity with minimal interval, diminishes the chance of our hearing other voices, especially when those voices are a little different. That is, if they come in from the edges, if they aren't quite like the voices we have already heard. It nearly destroys any chance that we might not only hear but listen to them. It renders us grossly inhospitable, and we, in turn, render our world inhospitable too. In fact, repetition may promote a lack of hospitality.
We want a wall and we'll build a wall. I said, where did that come from? All of a sudden, out of the blue. Out of the blue. And by the way, speaking of that, we will have strong borders and we will have the wall, and Mexico will pay for the wall. Mexico will pay for the wall, believe me. Believe me.
That's the last of those. They make the point, though, right? So if we actually do want to hear other voices, we might listen first to Friedrich Nietzsche's remarks on hearing music. This is what happens to us in music. First, one has to learn to hear a figure and melody at all, to detect and distinguish it. Then it requires some exertion and goodwill to tolerate it in spite of its strangeness, to be patient with its appearance and expression, and kind-hearted about its oddity. Finally, there comes a moment when we wait for it, when we sense that we should miss it if it were missing, and now it continues to compel and even enchant us. The strange may turn out to be beautiful, or at least rewarding, but first we have to listen, have to be hospitable to what we do not already understand. And we cannot then turn our new understanding into its own inhospitably sealed system of beliefs, as I suspect was the case with the angry woman in the graduate seminar with which I began. Instead, we have to listen slowly for what we do not already know, what we could not have said. We have to listen before we understand, but even more challengingly, without the presumption of understanding. Because this has been a bit dense, let me review briefly. We acquire our voices, and thus in some important measure ourselves interactively. We speak where we are listened for, and we continue to learn to speak. Our voices continue to change by opening hospitable, quiet spaces for others to speak as well. When we become hasty and inattentive, our speaking is mere imitation, part of a chorus in which all of some us simply says the same thing. We transform ourselves through words when we combine repetition, especially in community, with slow, even digressive exposition, so that repetition is a return with a difference, with new depth and thoughtfulness built in, and there is as much pleasure dwelling in the process of learning as in being able to repeat. When we disregard that transformative possibility by hurrying through words and learning both, we tend to cut out the long, slow process and leave only the repetition of what cannot change, because there is nothing new to bring to it, no new thoughtfulness, no considered discourse. This means that we do not quote with sometimes mischievous pleasure, hearing the echo of another voice, but rather that we only quote that between our voices and those we parrot, we take no notice of differences. Pure and rapid repetition is at its most effective when it goes viral, when contagion is all that there is, when we are no more than hosts for the virus of emotive vocalizing. Slow listening may still carry passion. Indeed, passion can be intensified by slowness as well as by repetition. But the sustained focus is likely to require more work and more practice, too. In community, as both speaking and learning must be, slowness allows affect to circulate and build, but it carries concepts too, and it embodies them. In repetition without dwelling between, we lose the meaningfulness of the language we voice, and because we have ceased to dwell in words and ceased to dare digression, we also begin to lose listening. What we hear instead is only what we already are, what cannot run the risk of changing us. The communal faith that originally worked as a bond that enabled language and meaning now intensifies into something more hermetic, disallowing anyone else from understanding meaning at all, perhaps more crucially, disallowing any other meaning from creeping in. Words and concepts that have meaning outside of the community may be transformed and even inverted to strengthen the distinctions of in and exclusion, as when populism turns upon a contemptuous loathing of much of a population. This isn't to suggest that there can be no value to soundbites or slogans, to catching the attention quickly or giving us mnemonics to hold on to. I don't even mean to claim that there is no value to the instant affective oomph that these short phrases carry. I do mean, though, to insist that they lose value if they are isolated from a slow, educational, thoughtful dwelling in thoughts and words in between repetitions, and if they become so affectively loud or constantly repeated that we cannot hear other voices. To attend to both the repetition and the excursus is slow. The soundbite gives us time for near-instant contagion. Repetition disposes us to the affect more and more quickly. But then we get stuck in ourselves, without the possibility of transfiguration, without being able to listen, without noticing that we have gone beyond quoting to allow our voices to be taken over with no new content of our own. We have endangered ourselves with our lack of hospitality, and we have become inhospitable through impatience and speed, through thoughtlessness, but also through so narrow a focus on outcome that we hardly care how we get there. There is value still, and perhaps we can even return to it in listening, uncomprehendingly but openly, in listening slowly to the strange. Perhaps there is still time to work slowly. Thank you. I'll close this so that it doesn't accidentally trump at you.
Okay, we're going to take questions, but I had one question I wanted to ask first, in an attempt maybe to expand. I say maybe expand because it's going to depend somewhat on your answer. So you talked a lot about listening slowly, and I'm wondering why you talked predominantly about listening slowly not as opposed to, but in exclusion rather than also about reading slowly. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if that's a theoretical position you're taking, if you're taking a position like Socrates in the Phaedrus that speech is better, that speech is more important, it's more true, because it can defend itself and explain itself in the immediate, or because of the pitch, the tempo, the rhythm you mentioned, how that brings a broader more significance to the speech than writing can convey, or whether it was just simply that's what's interesting you more now, lack of time, etc. Because I'm thinking, for example, that so many of us, like us, over maybe 30, maybe even 35, we used to do something called writing letters, and I know that a lot of you don't even want to write emails anymore, right? We've gone from letters to emails to tweets and texts. So there's in a sense, we don't want to read anything slowly. We want boom, instant. We want, in a sense, sound bites in written form as well.
Yeah. Oh, now I have to try not to answer so slowly that I take up the rest of the time. It's a great question. I actually am at least as interested in the question of slow reading. And really the only reason it doesn't come up here at greater length is not wanting to talk for 3 hours. I think I decided to focus on listening because my interest in reading was in part about reintroducing voice to reading, about really reading for the sound of it and paying attention again to sub-vocalizing in reading, rather than the sort of speed reading techniques in which you don't voice the words in your own head, which is necessarily a slower form of reading. So I'm really interested in reading as a form of listening, of actually listening to the text as you read it and paying attention to its oral qualities. I would never want to make reading of lesser importance, but I think that is probably the reason that I focused especially on listening. I am really interested in the question of the written soundbite, and it seems especially interesting in terms of the viral memes and videos that I mentioned, because I have been guilty too of quickly sharing or forwarding an article because the first paragraph looked really good and I agreed with it. And I do usually glance at the source, so I haven't too often been caught out in doing something that turned out to be wrong. But I do think that in reading it's at least as important, and that one of the many ways in which we might start to think about that is to start thinking about reading for voice again, really paying attention to the slow sound of the words. But yeah, that's a nice question. And I miss letters.
Well, I'll let others speak now. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, in the back.
First question?
Yes.
I do everything slowly anyways. You set up a nexus between voice, affect, and ideas in a very interesting way. I wonder what you would make of the community of those who live in silence, the hearing impaired, and what would sign language, how would sign language figure into the construct that you exposed here today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mentioned that I first started thinking about what came into this paper from that seminar I had attended, and that seminar was about my book on voice. And I actually wrote there that one question I didn't feel equipped to consider but really wanted someone to take up was the question of a voice without sound. I know, and for a couple of reasons. One is I am interested in voice because, or at least I was at first interested in voice because of the bodiliness of language, which the Academy so often seems to try to ignore. And that's clearly quite pronounced in sign language. It's a gestural rather than a sonic, I guess, right? Or an aural embodiment, but it's certainly there. And the other is that it's so clear to me, even from the few ASL speakers I know or have seen, that there's tremendous individuality in voice. And I know that there are local accents as well. And so it does seem to me that some of my interest in embodiment, in interchange, in the interplay of community and individuation could play out there as well, but I simply don't know enough. It's a community that is quite foreign to me, but I'm very interested in it. I hesitate to say more because I will often venture into places in which I'm likely to be stupid, but the odds go up a little too far there.
Thanks for trying that.
I would really love to see someone take that question on, though.
Well, it would be interesting to know, or to try to gauge where the commonalities lie and where the potential richnesses might emerge that would, in some ways, compensate for what is quite often seen or construed as a lack.
Yes, I think so too. Yeah.
I wonder, thank you, first of all, it's been very stimulating.
Thank you.
I wonder whether you see the classroom or the seminar room as a potential or an actual community in which there is an interaction between the person or persons leading the seminar and those who are taking the class or seminar.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Exactly how that community is structured and how much it can be fairly equal, how equally we can distribute power across it, does depend in part, of course, on what the class is, what the people attending are hoping to take away from it. But there's no question that those are communities. And one of the things that started my own interest in pedagogical voice and voice in the classroom was when I noticed that two things, that many of my best students, those who wrote best, understood best, seemed to have some of the liveliest engagement with ideas, were our theater majors. And part of the reason for that seemed to be that certainly they could read aloud very well, right? But in having to bring the proper mode of expression to a text, they had to make sure that they understood it. They couldn't just go along word by word. And I found that very intriguing. And I also noted that among the classes that seemed to be the best communities, there would also develop sort of in-jokes with each other, little points or even phrases to which they could return that also seemed to me to suggest that they were joining together in a way that had a lot to do with language. So I definitely think there are communities, and I haven't been able to develop my own pedagogy along thinking of those lines as well as I'd like to, but it's something that does interest me and that I'm trying to work on.
What's holding you up?
Time, like everyone, the ability to really develop new approaches and so on. So some things I've done are simply to have people read more aloud, right? To try to introduce possibilities for even performance or for more creative kinds of writing in classes that don't usually have that space. So I have tried some small things, but I think I would really just need a sabbatical to work on pedagogy to really make that happen.
Are there contexts outside of academia in this sort of hurricane weather that our culture is seeming to live in, where this kind of slow listening can take root and actually become helpful to us?
I hope so.
Yeah, me too, but you imagine some?
Yeah, the arts are an obvious possibility. Since I think a lot of art is really about a development of attentiveness to whatever medium is being worked in, looking or listening or moving. So that's one possibility. I also think that groups that are self-consciously community groups already have the advantage of being attentive to what makes a community, and of if you start asking, well, who else might be in this community, as they often must, that too, I think, requires a kind of listening to people and to how they situate themselves. So it's my hope that those might be possibilities. I wish I had stronger and more optimistic prescriptions, though.
Well, what you just said is interesting. My son actually lives in a small apartment complex that is owned by a Mennonite man, and they have quite an active community sense. And in spite of the fact that he's not religious and not Mennonite, he is a very heavy partaker in their community and actually has benefited greatly from that.
Nice. Yes, yeah. I think Spaces like the Mennonites or the Friends, the Quakers, tend to be especially good about opening space for others. And I don't know as much about Mennonite meetings, but meetings of the Friends are entirely devoted to listening to others. So that's a nice connection that I hadn't thought to make before.
Although you said you wish you could be a little bit more optimistic, I'm gonna. Oh my gosh, I almost said Trump you. I guess I just did, but I'm gonna be even more pessimistic and point out something, which is that I think it's an excellent question, and your example of your son's sort of not necessarily Mennonite, but Mennonite touched community is a good one. But there's also a danger in communities, which is increasingly, especially with technological communities, we get stuck in these echo chambers where we only listen to the community that agrees with us. And that's entirely counterproductive to what you were just talking about. Because then we don't hear the other voices. So it's not exactly a catch-22, but there is a certain tension in developing a community that can, in a sense, backfire as well.
Always, yeah.
I think one thing not entirely to counter, but like when I was in high school, I went to a charter school, and it was based off a Paideia system, which is like seminary.
Oh, nice.
I feel like that's not a sole community of people. It's not like focused in any kind of religion. It's not conglomerate of a certain ideal or like belief. It's more like a public school system. If they were to able to install like a Paideia type of system, that would be more, because like I've gone through seminaring through pieces of work, and I feel like that opens up the space for people to be able to like talk slowly, listen slowly, and everyone's their language and like just the ideas kind of integrate with each other, and people start, the whole community of like say 20 people talking, start all building off of each other to create like a better understanding. And I feel like that's good too, because there's always going to be arguments and rebuttaling between those type of like that like through a seminaring, but like that is like, that's also people are actually being able to listen to each other within those times, because like there can be an opposing factor, but like it's more interesting and stimulating to like want to listen to them to actually come up with an instant rebuttal.
Yes.
Yeah.
That. Yeah, that's a sort of utopian scenario for me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that sounds great.
Yeah.
I'm terribly sorry. The Honors College here does the same thing as well, and I really enjoy that.
Nice.
And one thing that I really enjoy about the Honors College is that we'll all read the same book, but we all come to class with totally different opinions on the book and totally different ideas, and it's really interesting and fun for me to see different perspectives, and the more that I listen, the more that I see different sides, the more that I can understand other people. Like, they come from different backgrounds than I have, and I've come from a different background than them. And so we can share with each other what we see just because of our past experiences that are either really different or just slightly different, but everyone has their own fingerprint on the conversation, and I really enjoy that. So.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and that ability to hear from a different set of experiences is just what I was hoping to elicit there.
Other questions? Yeah.
Are you aware of the movement called compassionate listening? It struck me that the compassionate side of it resonated with you.
Yes.
You opened up with the idea of hospitable.
Yeah. Yes,
slow,
it's clear.
Hospitable listening.
It's nice. I will have a look.
I don't know a whole lot about it, except that there's a group here at the local Friends meeting that does, and you don't study it in the normal sense of, if we think of it like studying, you sit together and practice it.
Yeah.
And one
Very
person
nice.
presents, one person tells a personal story or describes a situation. Often it's something that's traumatic or tense or transformative. but deeply meaningful to the person speaking. And the practice is to, in your terms, listen hospitably or compassionately.
Thank you for that. I'll definitely look into that phrase. That sounds very much along these lines. Thank you.
Any other questions?
One statement. I feel like in regards to like our generation, like from a viewpoint, I feel like when he was talking about like I would call like flashpoint reading or whatever, or like sharing his type of things, is like it's the thing that like I guess that's negative about it is that not necessarily is there a lot to do to counter it. There's more just to adapt to it. And so news is adapting to our generation, out of which they only give us like headliners, and people are only reading like flashpoint. Like they will say like a couple words saying like the most important thing. That's what usually a headline is, but then they'll give you a summary. But then no one ever reads beyond that.
Yeah.
Like, and like the news is adapted to that. Like I get like headliners from like Reuters or like the Washington Post and stuff like that, and like that's all we get. Like that's what most people are gonna read.
Yeah, that seems to me to be an interesting tension. I don't know what to make of it, but an interesting tension with the remarkable depth of investigative reporting that is being done. So you have people who are really putting in the slow research and writing time, even though their audiences are mostly reading very quickly. And I'm not sure what to make of
That
it.
also becomes very repetitive, like you're saying. Like the words are, there's very little room for a lot of like banter and everything else to be involved with that. You just get like 22-year-olds with a shot, and then you like hear that somewhere else, and it's just consistent or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, and I also, just to follow up on that, I wonder, I don't know the answer to this, but I wonder how much the medium itself affects that willingness to read. Simply, I say that simply like anecdotally, because if you hand me a Sunday New York Times, I will sit down and I will read through that thing for like 3 hours. But when I go onto my phone and read those news feeds like you're talking about, I get to like the 4th paragraph and I'm like, oh, God, when is this going to end? You know, like even though I'm willing to sit for 3 hours with a newspaper, I'm not willing to sit longer than like 45 seconds on my phone reading, you know, something that might be the same topic. Did you have something else?
Why do you think it's so different?
I'm not sure. I mean, I just thought of this when you were making that
I think it's
observation.
the adaptation to technology, knowing that when we use phones, it's purely for like things that are fast communication. So then we take everything that is that device as fast communication.
That's pretty reasonable.
I mean, I still know people of my generation that do like write letters and sit down and read like full-length novels. Like, I mean, I write a lot of letters, and I've actually gotten more letters from people my age and younger than I have ever from, you know, older generations. I do think there's something different about my generation for sure, but I don't think it's like, oh, it's just your generation. I think it's been like a progressional thing that doesn't just affect one generation, but affects all generations.
No
Kind
question.
of like what you said, like you'll just scroll through on your phone, but you'll sit down and take time to read that. And I think that one reason why our generation is so ragged on is because we didn't grow up with, you know, having everyone read a newspaper. We grew up in a time of technology where it was all about, hey, this is quicker, this is better, and we were taught in school, like, you need to do it this way, you need to, you know, be, like, I was timed on almost all of my tests. So it's all about speed. And so I don't think it's really, like, our generation's fault. I know that's not what you were trying to say, but I hear it a lot in cultures, and especially from older people, that, oh, it's your generation that's messing up this country, when it's not really our fault.
In so many ways, really not your doing.
I love reading novels, and I love writing letters, and it's difficult for me because I wasn't entirely like raised, like in the schools we didn't learn that stuff to actually like sit down and do stuff we learned. You have to be fast, or else you're not going to survive. So.
Right, and it's a good point, and I would say that what I said earlier, I mean, I know you weren't directly criticizing me, but it's a good criticism of what I said earlier, because I said those of us over 30 or 35. I think that's inaccurate. I think it's probably more accurate to say those of us who are writing now in 2017 versus those of us who were writing in, let's say, 1985, okay? So that might seem to be something about age differences, like I'm older than you, but really that's more about epochs, that's more about society changing, because I write fewer letters than I used to. And you know, I'm older, I'm the older generation, and yet I don't write as many as I used to either. So, did you want to add?
Yeah, I am older, and I think it's my generation that quit writing letters. You know, I mean, really, I'm a baby boomer, and totally, my generation quit writing letters, period. And quit communicating publicly in many ways. But your generation, in fact, decides on an opinion and designs an opinion for public consumption many times a day. It's actually more communicative than my generation is, I would say. So to me, it's quite interesting. And it is sort of an optimistic piece of the whole picture, actually.
Well, so the time is up, but you can still come up and keep talking.